Good morning. I'm your host, Ashley DeGiovanni, and we are so happy that you decided to wake up with us this morning for this episode of Wake Up with Patient Safety. We have guests with us from all across the company, from frontline associates to top leaders, to talk with us about the overarching focus around patient safety and all we're doing around it. So grab your favorite morning beverage and get comfortable as we dig in. I'm so excited to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Rebecca Winokur, Senior Physician Executive with the Clinical Leadership Team and Health Equity Service Line Leader. Thank you, Dr. Winokur, so much for joining us today. I'm excited to dig in and talk about ethical AI with you, and I think that we can learn a lot with today's topic. So to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about you and break down a little bit more about what ethical AI is and all that surrounds it?
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. And it's great to be here. I'm excited to talk about this with you all. So first, who am I? So I'm a physician executive. I sit on the clinical leadership team, and primarily my job is around partnering with clients to help them realize their strategic goals and achieve optimal patient outcomes. I'm also quite passionate about health equity and service Cerner's health equity service line leader. On a personal note, I'm the mom to two teenagers. My family is biracial. I'm on a continuous journey of education. And a few things about me: I serve on the board of a local equity organization. I also sit on the school board's committee on equity. Okay, so let's dig into ethical AI. And to understand, we first need to level set on a couple of terms. So what is artificial intelligence? We hear artificial intelligence and machine learning interchanged. We all have slightly different understandings. So, kind of in general thinking, I like to think of AI as something that's mimicking human behavior, right? So, you think about voice, vision, language, all to enhance human abilities to take action more efficiently and more precisely. And so within artificial intelligence sits machine learning. And that's often, you'll see in the literature and lay press, ML. And essentially that takes it a step further and uses data and math to recognize and learn patterns. That then creates new insights, and then the model itself, the machine learning model, learns from those insights. And the idea is to reduce cognitive load, to improve workflow optimization, and we could go through hundreds, thousands of other use cases across sectors. But in healthcare, we are leveraging AI in many ways, operationally, patient care, and lots of things related to population health and care management. So we're talking about bias today, and as that relates directly to patient safety. And so what does bias mean? So in my mind, that's essentially a negative or positive idea that I would make about one group and its members relative to another. So I could do that at an individual level. I could do that. That could happen at an organizational level. And so what I'm saying is you apply disproportionate weight in favor or against an idea, a thing, a person. And then that informs how one interacts with people and organizations. And in healthcare can lead to lower quality care and poor outcomes. And so you'll hear about a couple types of bias. Explicit bias is where someone's completely aware and believes that their impression and evaluations are entirely accurate. Another type that we hear about a lot is implicit bias. That's considered unconscious bias. So I may unintentionally come into a situation with bias that I'm not aware of. And we see that quite a bit across the healthcare industry. It's something that's being addressed on several levels. And for me, I think it requires a certain level of humility to acknowledge that we all step into our roles with a certain level of bias based on our education, training, lived experiences, etc. And then lastly, I want to just mention what is ethical AI. So we think of that at Cerner as essentially a system of moral principles that govern a person's behavior or conducting of an activity. So you could apply that to artificial intelligence when you think about how can we prevent, mitigate, evaluate, correct for bias that leads to poor outcomes, whether they're unintended and unexpected or intentionally created, which is becoming less and less of an issue. And so there's a growing demand as this field of AI is evolving and addressing some key issues, clinician burnout, patient safety and quality of care. We're seeing this growing demand for fair and transparent machine learning. So that's definitely gained momentum during COVID-19, right? It's really led to a shining light on some of the challenges that we've been seeing and some evolving challenges that are coming with AI. And so we're seeing an increase in regulatory interest and oversight and an increase in industry level collaboration.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you actually did, kind of level set with all of those because, I know that a lot of people can think bias is very negative. So I'm glad that you took the time to talk through those as we get into this. So thank you. What are the different ways bias can arise in healthcare AI?
Oh my gosh, there's
I
so
bet you
much.
could talk for days about this.
I know, exactly. You need to refill your coffee cups. So there AI and machine learning in particular are vulnerable to bias in so many ways. If you think of how we just defined AI and machine learning within that, there's some interesting differences in terms of where and how bias can come in. So if you take kind of a basic algorithm, if this, then this, the algorithm's going to go out through the EHR, grab some data, plug it into a if this, then this situation, and then come out with a recommendation, some type of clinical decision support, maybe alerting the clinician that they need to go back and consider another type of evaluation or screening, for instance. So if the data that's being used, the data itself is biased, maybe some data is missing, maybe it's missing because of interoperability and technical challenges, or maybe it's missing because EHR documentation is poor and incomplete, and even that could be because of structural biases that maybe keep patients from accessing care. So you can imagine the depth of potential of bias just in the data itself. We also see, we say, okay, we're going to grab this piece of data to help inform the algorithm. The data itself is a proxy for something, right? We asked a question to get that data. We had a need for that data. That data is then representing some concept. And is that concept truly representative of the problem we're trying to address or the data we really want? So the proxy, the data proxy or how it's proxied can also bring in bias. And there are lots of ways that the data itself can be biased, specific kind of naming convention around that. But I want to jump to kind of adding to that complexity is now let's take a machine learning model, right? And we talked about that model learning from patterns it recognizes. So it has some certain extent of autonomy. And with that, the model learns, it evolves, and it does something that we call drifting. It doesn't end where it started because it's getting smarter, theoretically, hopefully. I mean, it is getting smarter, but hopefully in the way that we intended. And so if you think of the bias that can then enter into that picture, oh my gosh, it's enormous. So think about like the choice that you make during the development of the model. So what outcome are you after? What problem are you trying to solve? Is that the right problem? Are you using the right approximations of the outcome to represent the problem you're trying to solve? Then think about, how do you translate the data into inputs? Are we, the data is complex. Are we using granular enough data, for example? So continuing on in this theme about the development, so what about our methodology? Are we using an approach that has been mitigated as much as possible by the potential of bias? So another interesting thing in the piece in the development of the model is the intention of how it's used. So are we focusing on or targeting the right group. And by right, I mean the group that theoretically the hospital organization in partnership with the community has identified, or the hospital organization based on standards or their own experience has identified as the problem being solved. Are we solving the right problem? Are we are we getting the right feedback on that very question in terms of how the model's used? And underneath that, which brings us to transparency, is do we have the right clinicians and users and scenarios within the touch points of a patient's experience with the healthcare system using the model and using it the way it was intended? And so that takes us to the question of, okay, if we think about who's using the model and how, do we as a vendor own that information and therefore the end user can just have faith that it's working well? Or do we need the end user to understand some of the back end or intention or potential prediction level intention of the model? And it's a really important thing, not just because you think about liability, which is important, but think about, right, it is important. You think about like we're trying to reduce cognitive load, but we also want to empower the providers and clinicians, and even more importantly, the patients themselves. And so this question about how much do we want the person to know, not from a proprietary protective sense, but from a what's, a point of view of what is the most optimal ownership and understanding of the model itself, and achieving the least biased best outcomes. Another big one that we focus on quite a bit here at Cerner is the diversity, equity, and inclusion piece, right? So do we have the right people at the table? Are those people representative of a diverse population? So just to kind of summarize that, so the data itself, is it the right data that we're pulling? Are we missing data? Is the data that we're pulling, are we pulling the wrong data through bias? Are we making the right assumptions when we ask the question initially? Are we testing? We think about methodology, and we didn't get too deeply into this, but think about something like testing the algorithm, right? So you think about the way we test the algorithm. Are we using the right set of data? Is it representative of the population we're trying to help? Did we aggregate the data correctly when it came into the EHR? We also talked about the model usage. Are we using it the way it was intended? Are we predicting at the level we meant to be? In terms of transparency and model usage, who needs to know what about the model in order to mitigate and minimize bias in the use of the model? And do we have the right people at the table? And I would say those are sort of the big buckets inside of kind of where that bias can come from, and gives you a sense of the complexity, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, that makes sense, but it seems so complex, and it is so important about the data and making sure that you're solving the right problem. And data is so huge, and especially how you've explained with AI and machine learning, because if you're not putting the right, looking at the right data and putting the right things into place, that machine learning isn't going to be continuing to grow the way that you want it to, like you said, right? And it is key to have the right involved. And I love that you're being inclusive and looking and having the whole diversity, people involved, so that we can think about, is everything being looked at?
Yeah, and what you find, honestly, Ashley, is when you think, okay, we've covered what we think we can, if you step back one more layer, you realize, wow, there's even like a bigger bias coming into picture here, which is why you need the diversity of people at the table, and the humility to acknowledge that there is no right answer. There is no end point. It's an active process with humility that helps us do it better by recognizing that it's so complex and we can't possibly cover all the potential biases.
I love that. That's a great leadership skill that you have. So I read an article where a chief technology officer at Royal Philips suggest building 3 types of diversity into every aspect of AI development,
Okay.
diversity in people, diversity in data, and diversity in validation, which you kind of talked on just a few minutes ago. But how do you think that we can continue to do this here at Cerner? Kind of a little bit, you kind of talked on how we're doing this, but how do you think that we can step this up or, continue to do this here at Cerner?
Yeah, great question. And so I think what they were getting at, and just before we get into kind of how we're addressing it, is, so diversity in people. So we talked about the right people at the table, and what we mean are the analysts, the consultants, the end users, the patients, the community service providers. All of that needs to be considered when you think about diversity of people. Um, the diversity of data. So that gets back to like the testing set. Are we using the right set of data? And honestly, we don't. So what we can do is understand the characteristics of a giant data set that we might test a model against. But we don't have a lot of control over the data itself. What I mean by that is the granularity of the data, the way the data may have been aggregated. The data may represent a chronic disease, a certain set of a population that's historically been marginalized, and a disease, that we want to look at in that population. But then we have to remember the structural and individual barriers that have developed over time and are ongoing that may have led to lower quality care or the patient not accessing care as much. And so we have to keep that in mind when we're pulling that data and testing against it. And then diversity and validation. So that's a concept that helps us reduce the risks associated with the unintended outcomes. So we might develop, so we have a problem we want to solve. We think it's the right problem. We develop a model. We mitigate for bias. And we think we know what's going to happen. And we've seen this with lots of clients, and it's really neat to start to hear how our client organizations are addressing this. And so we have this assumption about what we're going to see, like what's the disparity? We think we know, and then we discover that there's an unintended consequence, maybe a causal relationship, that turns out to be the consequence or outcome we're looking for, but we didn't even know about it. We didn't even think about it. And so we have to kind of bring that back to the table and make sure that we bring some diversity in our approach to that, those who are validating, how we validate it. So it's a pretty interesting, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a really interesting way to think about the importance of diversity in this process. In terms of, so what are we doing at Cerner? We're doing lots of cool stuff. And while I know it feels early in the process or the evolution at an industry level, there's so many players and stakeholders that are doing really, really cool stuff. And so at Cerner, one of the neat things we're doing is we've placed under the direction of our patient safety organization and high reliability organization, we've placed the ethical AI committee under that organization, which affords it some nice flexibility and freedoms to be entirely transparent, to bring all problems to the table. And what it's doing is forcing us to, first of all, develop what does this committee want to do? How do we want to help Cerner with guidelines, many of which have already been developed by our intelligence team, but how do we incorporate patient safety and quality into those processes? And then how do we ensure accountability? How do we then take in, understand and evaluate instances of poor outcomes, sort of like you think about medication process, right? You think, okay, there was a medication outcome that was negative. We have a process to surface that, to bring it to that committee underneath the patient safety organization, and a process to resolve it. So developing that framework as it applies to AI is a huge piece of this committee's charter, and then of course resolving it and communicating that back to both internal stakeholders and our clients. So that's a big one. We're also thinking about education, so doing things like this. We've talked to our engineers at DevCon, just talking about this. There are focus groups throughout the company talking about equity, and they're bringing in these conversations about ethical AI. What's that?
I said, I love that. I love that.
Right? It's great. It's really great to see. Another thing that Cerner is taking the lead on is collaboration. So we're working across the industry with nonprofits, with private organizations, with hospital organizations. We're in conversations regularly with regulatory bodies and oversight bodies, and attending lots of these think tanks and work groups, and really taking in the whole ecosystem that delivers more ethical, unbiased AI. So that's pretty neat. And you know, as many of us who are part of Cerner, and hopefully those who interact with us are finding, is that we are bringing this humility to the conversation. So we're focused on this empathetic culture, right? So a safe culture that's built on the principles of health equity. And so, you know, that concept of organizational transformation, organizational justice is a really big piece of this. And we have lots of stakeholders, notably our DE&I organization itself. And similarly, along with that is the idea of transparency, accountability, communication. And so we're starting to put into place some pathways and frameworks that kind of bring all those pieces together. And it's pretty exciting. And so I feel like every month we have something new happening that we've established, we've gotten buy-in, and we're moving forward. So definitely something to keep an eye on in terms of what Cerner's doing in this area.
That is great. And I love that you're talking about the collaboration, you're breaking down those silos. I think that's something that, in the past, Cerner's had such a hard time with. And I love that as we're, moving forward, we're continuing to break down those silos. And I love hearing that, and everything that you're talking about doing just sounds amazing. And I can't wait to hear all the continued work. And the stuff about the educational stuff and about the algorithm monitoring that you guys are doing to continue to improve upon it is just going to make it so much more impactful for not only our associates to continue to grow and build, more, innovative things, but also for our clients and our patients. So I think that it's just going to be so amazing.
Yeah, me too.
I'm excited for it.
It's very exciting. It's incredible, really. Yeah, and you think about, like if you have the opportunity to have a conversation with some of our data analysts who are involved in this work, it's really fun. It's fascinating. And when you think about a topic like something we've talked about, like data set representation, and there's just so many interesting things to think about there. If you think about machine learning and does the machine learning model, it can learn and it can evolve and drift. Can it think? Does it have judgment in the non-traditional ways that we think about that? So there's so much brain power here at Cerner and across the industry asking these questions. And it's really neat to, if you or anyone listening has the opportunity to get into those conversations, they're really fun. And they always, for me, leave me with an aha, somewhat unanswered question, information out of them.
I'll ask my next question in a second, but I am, just excited. I've been wanting to do this talk with you for a long time, and I'd love to talk to more data analysts to just hear about stuff. I worked in healthcare for 14 years before joining Cerner, and I just think that so much of, the machine learning and AI can continue to help and improve the workflow and everything for, healthcare providers. So I think that the work that is being put into it and the knowledge and the continued learning is just going to continue to make what we do so much better for our clients and the patients. So I'm excited.
Absolutely.
My next question. So the intent of AI is obviously to help healthcare providers make, more objective decisions and provide more efficient care. I know that AI technology relies on data. We've talked a lot about data to train, the machines, the AI, the algorithms to make decisions, and it continues to learn. And it's important to ensure that that data used to train the AI is representative, diverse, to help mitigate potential harm to the public. and especially to historically marginalized populations. What are we doing here to make sure that all diverse populations are represented in the data? I know that you mentioned you were working with the diversity and inclusion group, but what else are we kind of working on or doing?
Yeah, that's a really good point to talk about. So speaking about diversity in the data itself, so we talked a little bit about representation. We talked a little bit about the target population and validation of the outcomes. But we want to keep in mind that I think if you talk to a data analyst, they would tell you this, that we can't ensure that all the populations are represented. We have very little control over the data itself, how we use it, how we aggregate it, how we understand it. We have more control over. What we do have control over, though, is understanding the data, right, that we're using. And why it might be biased. So that's I think an important point, and something that really is new to me in the last couple of years to learn. But we do some things that help to mitigate this and evolve this thinking. And so validation piece. So if there's we can essentially we can recalibrate the model, right? So we can help it evolve towards a particular population of patients that our clients might be looking at and trying to help. So we essentially we can run the model in what's called silent mode. So we can validate it prospectively before it's actionable. And we can do that over time. So that's one thing that our intelligence group and our analysts know much more about than I do.
Maybe we'll have them on as a follow-up to ask some additional questions. That would be kind of interesting.
I think it would be great. And then so think about that calibration piece. So tailoring a model to one geographic location versus another. If we have a hospital organization we work with in one area that's addressing certain challenges, barriers, social determinants of health, and then a different organization in an entirely different geographic area with a different set of social determinants of health, let's say, we can calibrate to those different settings to an extent. We also have a way to monitor, right? We can monitor, we can update, we can adapt. We have a structure we're developing that I mentioned inside our high reliability organization and patient safety organization to monitor and update and adapt in response, or I should say really to adapt and respond to the monitoring, updating, and adaptations that our analysts are doing. So when things go wrong, we can see that hopefully sooner, and then run that through a root cause analysis and work on improving that. We can also think about the biased data that we might be getting. Can we do things to close that gap? Let's think about missing data, right? Is there a way that we can identify it with that it's missing with the right subject matter experts, and then bring that into the conversation about how to pull the right data or how to adapt our understanding or prediction. Let's say if it's a predictive model, understand that prediction has this certain set of biases and we could correct for this amount of that or not. But we, being a vendor of both this technology itself and the services, are in a really nice position to be able to bring those experts into the conversation to be sure that we're really thinking about, okay, is there a way that we can help our clients fill those gaps of missing data? We also, our analyst teams can recognize unusual data patterns. So that can be a red flag that there might be bias. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little difficult with an unexpected outcome, but it's often patterns that we're looking at. And so you want to be careful about the assumption you're making around the pattern you'll see. But the pattern, following the pattern, using data analytics to look at the pattern gives us insight into potential bias. We also have to think about latency, right? So this is happening in as much real time as possible, but across the industry, right, we're still working on reducing latency. And so if you think about insights essentially arriving at a time other than when the patient's being served, so any point in time after that, we want to reduce that latency in terms of when we can really evaluate, understand, and address potential biases that come up. And again, I would say that intended use, the data will be biased if we're using the model in the wrong way, right? And so then we're pulling the wrong data. So we can always be thinking about are are we using this the way we intended, and are we bringing the end user into that conversation so that they too are using it the way it's intended and not drawing insights and clinical decision support on data that was not appropriate for their situation.
Yeah, sounds like you guys really have a lot really going into it, but some awesome things to really go into finding since you don't have control over the sample sizes, to find
Right.
disruptions around the data. So that's good.
Yeah.
It seems like it's very complex, but interesting.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
According to CNN Business, gender bias could also cause problems for facial recognition software that uses AI, such as security applications at like concerts and airports, such as in sports arenas. A concern that also extends into gender binary. If AI gender as simply male and female doesn't align with modern perspectives of non-binary and transgender expression, causing potential harm for these communities. What are we doing in the healthcare aspect of AI to make sure that our data also doesn't have those same biases, which I'm sure that, same kind of thing you said, we don't have control over the data, but what kind of things are we doing here at Cerner around that aspect?
Yeah, that's a really, really critical piece of this puzzle. So I'd say that the number one thing we're doing, but we could probably debate, they're all probably equally important, is surfacing and amplifying our client's voice around this, because they are the closest to the patient, right? So who is the population that they are helping with this particular model? How are they collecting the data that then informs that? Um, and are they part of the process in terms of evaluation and fully understanding, let's say, again, a prediction model, these were the outcomes, did that match what you expected in terms of the patients that you know? Because we're, as a vendor, we're a bit removed, right, direct from that direct patient contact.
Yeah.
That also brings up the point of the data itself and how we're collecting it. So there's no regulation right now around how to collect it.
Okay.
There is some regulation around, there's starting to be around some of the data points that are collected, but not in terms of using them, how they're used, how they're protected. Um, and, it's really important for us to be engaged with regulatory bodies, both to be a thought leader and to be in front of the regulations in service, to our clients. And there's a huge focus right now in the industry, regulatory world around this piece. And so we're all expecting, and I would say hoping for, regulation to help us do this well and to be accountable to it. It's an interesting situation in terms of the data integrity. There's bias potentially in the person collecting the information. We might be asking the question at registration in front of a whole, waiting room.
Yeah.
My understanding registering a patient and the patient's understanding of a particular data point may be very different. There's a lot of focus in the industry around the context. So to understand the data and maintain its integrity, the more context, the better, right? And so do we really understand the context? And do we have people who can speak to from lived experience the important pieces of this to, let's say, a patient who identifies as non-binary? I'm learning, I'm on, as I said, a lifelong journey, but as a cis woman, I can't know what that experience is like, but I can listen and hear and help elevate that voice at the table to make sure that we're doing the best with the data. So as a vendor, we're working closely with our clients, our regulatory bodies, the industry as a whole on data integrity. So that's, is it the right data? Are we understanding the data the same way? The context of the data, the privacy and safety of that data, and then how it's used. And so it's great to see there's some regulation around how the data is exchanged, and some data points to collect. But there's just so much more that's coming, and honestly, it's an area of concern to it should be to all of us, but certainly to those who care for and are patients who identify outside of the traditional binary system, as we understand that it's not so, but we're still asking those people to come into a system that's based on kind of older understanding and beliefs. I will also add that many of the challenges around that data bias are mirrored and similar to many of the other groups who are marginalized or experience poor outcomes and disparities because of the way we deliver care traditionally. So many of the things we've talked about apply, but those are kind of some additional challenges that we're facing. And although it's concerning, it's difficult for patients, it's also exciting. There's so much momentum and so much opportunity in that area. So more to come on that, I'm sure, just in the months to come, never mind, next year if we have this conversation again. Hopefully I'll be able to tell you that we're doing more at an industry level.
Yeah, I think that, it's just that from what you've said, we're continuing that transparency and collaboration, and you've talked about the regulation just to, to continue to overcome that, the gender binary and non-binary bias is just to continue that, and hopefully, it will come up to the same level as the other work that we're doing. Just got to continue that work.
Yeah, exactly. And integrate the thinking into all of our work so that it then doesn't become siloed. And so, across the industry, there's an effort to do that. At Cerner, there's a real commitment from leadership to do that.
Wonderful.
But it's transformation, and so change is tough.
Yes, that change is tough. That is definitely so true. In June of 2021, the World Health Organization, who released the first global report on AI in healthcare with 6 principles to avoid health disparities in the field. I am sure we are all working through all of these, and I didn't know if you would want to talk to any of the work we're doing to align with these 6 principles.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're bringing this up. This is really great work. It's really the first of its kind at this global scale that's happening. And the goal of World Health Organization's work in this area is to maximize the benefits of AI while minimizing the risks and pitfalls. And so they've got this set of principles, protecting human autonomy, right? So this whole shift to patient-centered and whole patient care and the patient owning their data. And so seeing that supported and prioritized at a global level is really exciting. And many of our services and technology products and solutions speak to that and move to that direction. There's lots of complications around that, but it's a commitment and goal across the industry, I would say, and we're certainly part of that. In terms of the promoting human health and well-being and public interest, which is I would say their second priority principle. Again, that's happening through a couple things. Our high reliability organization and patient safety organization, our culture of humility, and our collaboration across the industry, among many other things. They speak to transparency, explainability, and that gets back to what we were talking about earlier. We don't want to overburden and add to that cognitive load. We want to reduce that, but we also need to consider these really key pieces and transparency at lots of different levels. So accountability and fostering responsibility is another key one, and that's coming through our, I would say, through our leadership and the various organizations that are directly working on this and beginning to work together on this. And then promoting that AI is responsive and sustainable. Some of the basic principles about patient safety organization is this ongoing, very open, iterative, evolving process. And so that's, the World Health Organization is promoting that. CERN has been doing that in other ways, and now is embracing that for ethical AI. And so that's pretty neat to see as well, that we're aligned with that quite well. Growing, learning, always sustainable, always open for doing better, never at an end point or a final answer.
I love that, especially, because the WHO is, the World Health Organization is, it's the world, and we're an international company. And, I love that we are, aligning with that. Sometimes I feel like we get so focused in Kansas City, and we forget sometimes that we are an international company. So I love that.
Yes, I also wanted to mention that in the UK, we have a team devoted to health equity work, really committed to it. And they're doing some incredible stuff with their clients, with regulatory bodies. It's pretty neat to be another group to bring in and talk to.
That'd be
I'm
great.
volunteering lots of people to do this.
That's awesome. That's great. Dr. Winokur, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and share what you're doing. I think that we can learn a lot from what you're doing around the ethical AI, machine learning, the bias, and, like you said, talking to some of the analysts. Do you have any parting comments or calls to action that you would like to end with for our listeners?
Yeah, so again, would reiterate, this is a journey. It's a journey that requires humility and collaboration to be successful. And I would encourage people as a call to action to get curious about this. There are lots of resources that we have at Cerner, as well as some resources outside of Cerner that I will pass along that are a great starting point in terms of where you can look to learn more. I'd also encourage you to reach out to me via email. Happy to talk, to try to address concerns, questions, or probably more importantly, to direct you to the right people to address your concerns. So feel free to do that as well.
That's great. And I will link those for everyone. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you again, Dr. Winokur. Make sure to join us next month for our next video podcast. Remember, each month we have new topics, new guests, but always our favorite morning beverage. And don't forget to complete the feedback survey so that we can continue to bring you valuable information.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.